A blizzard hit my ranch. Then I found my generator dragged into the HOA president's driveway. A whiteout storm slammed into my Wyoming ridge the night the HOA stole the one thing keeping me alive: my generator. I followed the drag marks straight into the president's driveway. Not knowing she'd push this fight so far, she'd end up facing the law itself. If you've ever stood your ground against unfair rules, hit subscribe and stick with me. This story hits hard. The wind was already bending the pines sideways by the time I turned off the county road and onto the long gravel stretch that led to my ranch. Snow came at the windshield in hard, slanted sheets, thick enough that the world narrowed down to two ghostly beams of light and the rattle of ice on glass. Out here on Rourke Ridge, storms didn't just arrive. They came down like judgment, settling over the land with a weight that made even the cattle quiet. I'd seen plenty of Wyoming winters, but this one had the kind of bite that made a man's breath catch in his chest. My boots hit the ground and sank almost a foot deep. The storm hissed around me, needling my face, filling my ears with a low, icy roar. My hands were stiff from the 12-hour shift I'd just wrapped. Half the county stranded on Highway 15 after a pileup. So all I wanted was heat, light, and a warm roof. That old generator of mine, bolted to the steel brackets beside the workshop, was supposed to make that simple. Even in the darkest blizzard, its steady hum had always been there waiting for me when the grid failed. But tonight, there was no hum. A strange stillness clung to the air, broken only by the squeal of the wind squeezing between the boards of the barn. I slowed my steps, a prickling on the back of my neck. Something was off. The kind of off a sheriff learns to trust. When I rounded the corner toward the generator pad, my breath fogged and froze in the shape of a curse before I could speak it aloud. The generator was gone. Not misplaced. Not toppled. Not broken. Gone. Ripped straight out of the ground. The steel bolts had been sheared like cheap wire, leaving nothing but raw metal stubs poking out from the concrete. The snow hissed across the empty patch where it had sat for a decade, and the fence beside it sagged like something heavy had been dragged through. For a long moment, I just stood there, snow stacking on my hat, lungs burning from the cold. Of all the things a man can lose in a Wyoming winter, a generator isn't an inconvenience. It's survival. Mine powered more than lights. It kept the security system alive, fed the cabin heater, and made sure no one could sneak up on my property unnoticed. Out here, miles from town, your generator is your heartbeat. I knelt, brushing away the drifting snow. Long, gouged drag marks stretched away from the pad, leading out the gate and down the road like a trail left by someone who didn't care about hiding their tracks. Whoever did this had moved fast and messy, probably right as the storm was rolling in. The prints were half filled by fresh snow, but one thing was clear. They weren't heading toward the county road. They were heading toward the HOA subdivision. More specifically, toward the house of Marla Hensley. The wind cut across my face as I rose to my feet. Even in a storm like this, some details stick out. The drag lines curving around the bend, the sharp turn toward the paved private street, the slight angle in the tracks like someone fighting the weight of the machine. Every sign pointed to the same destination. Of all the people on this ridge, why Marla? My breath thickened as I followed the trail. The storm swirled harder with each step, white flakes stinging my eyes, the air tasting like iron and ice. The cedar trees groaned overhead. My boots crunched on old frozen gravel underneath the fresh blanket of snow, each step sinking deeper as the ground sloped toward the HOA homes clustered at the base of the hill. I tightened my coat around me, but it wasn't the cold that made my jaw clench. Marla Hensley, president of the Ridgeview Lakeside HOA, was the kind of woman who treated rules like weapons and neighbors like trespassers. In the year since she took over the board, she'd cracked down on porch railings, barn colors, Christmas lights, and anything else she thought threatened her spotless vision of community order. She'd knocked on my door once before realizing my patience wasn't something to test, or so I'd thought. Now, the storm swallowed the road behind me as I approached the first row of mailboxes. The drag marks curved with precision, straight toward Marla's driveway. My generator had left a final scar in the snow where the tracks ended, the shape unmistakable. Scraped metal, broken ice, and a rectangular imprint half buried beneath the drifts. I clenched my fists. My breath plumed out in hard, white bursts. In the flurry of snow, I could see the faint glow of Marla's porch light flickering through the storm, a warm yellow square cutting into the blue-white darkness. That was when another thought struck me, sharp and unwelcome. Why would she take the one thing keeping me safe out here? The question tugged at me, pulling harder with every step toward her house. Because generators don't just walk away, and Marla didn't do anything without a reason. Maybe it was about appearances, or power, or something buried deeper in the paperwork she loved to wave around. But as I stepped into her driveway, snow whipping sideways, that porch light burning like a dare, one thing settled heavy in my gut. Whatever reason she had, it wasn't good. And tonight, in the heart of a Wyoming blizzard, Marla Hensley had chosen the wrong man to provoke. Why would she dare seize the one thing keeping me alive on this ridge? The question echoed in my mind as I stepped onto her porch, snow clinging to my coat, the wind shoving at my back like it wanted me to get this over with. Her porch light flickered inside a glass lantern, casting a yellow halo over the storm-torn yard. I knocked once, but before my knuckles even left the wood, the door swung open, as if she'd been perched behind it, waiting for her moment. Marla stood there in a quilted vest far too thin for a storm like this, lips pursed, hair pinned so tight it looked painful. Her arms folded across her chest with an attitude that could frost glass long before the blizzard did. "Well," she said with a high, satisfied tilt of her chin, "I wondered when you'd come stumbling up here. Thought you ranch types handled weather better than this." She gave me a long, slow once-over, as if measuring how much trouble I'd be to her freshly swept porch. "Marla," I said, keeping my voice flat, steady, the sheriff tone I used when I didn't want someone to hear the anger simmering beneath. "My generator was taken off my property, dragged straight into your driveway. I'd like to know why." She smirked, a thin slice of a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Oh, that ugly thing? Yes. I made sure it was removed. It violated our community standards for visible emergency equipment." She said it like she was reciting scripture. "We won't have industrial junk cluttering the view of Ridgeview Lakeside. Property values matter here, Daniel. A certain aesthetic." She gestured vaguely at the swirling storm, as if the blizzard itself should admire her taste. I stared at her, breath steadying as another gust slammed against the side of the house. "That generator was bolted to my land. You had no right to touch it." Her brows shot up. "Your land is subject to HOA oversight. Everything in this community is, including unsightly machinery." She leaned forward, lowering her voice with a smug sort of intimacy. "You really should read the rule book, Daniel. It keeps misunderstandings from happening." Snow collected on my hat brim and began sliding off in slow, wet clumps. I let the silence sit long enough to make her shift her weight. The truth was, she didn't know who I was or what authority I actually carried on this ridge. To her, I was just another middle-aged rancher coming home late. Too quiet, too dusty, too independent for her taste. That was fine. Let her underestimate me. Folks like Marla turned their own ignorance into rope. I took a breath, watching the vapor curl between us. "Move it back," I said evenly. "Now." Her laugh was soft, like brittle paper crackling in a flame. "Absolutely not. And if you bring another one onto the property, another eyesore, you'll be fined again and again until you understand how this community works." She angled her chin, cold and triumphant. "Some people live out here to take pride in their homes. Others—" Her eyes swept over my snow-soaked boots and flannel collar. "Well, some just don't fit the Ridgeview image." My jaw tightened, but I held her gaze. I'd dealt with county drunks swinging bottles, with felons who hid steel under their coats, with grieving families on midwinter nights. None of them got under my skin the way Marla's brand of petty arrogance did, the kind dressed in pearls and wrapped in policy, wielding fines like knives. "Enjoy your evening," she said sweetly, "and do try to stay warm. I hear blizzards can be unforgiving." With that, she began to close the door, slow enough to savor the gesture. But before it latched, I caught a glimpse past her shoulder. My generator sitting on a dolly in her foyer, half covered with a blanket like a stolen relic. It took every ounce of discipline I had not to push through that doorway and haul the thing back myself. Instead, I stepped back, letting the decisions settle into me like cold iron. She didn't just take something practical, she took something essential on a night where the wrong temperature could kill a man. And she did it with a smile. The door clicked shut. The porch light hummed above me. Snow swirled in tight circles across the steps, gathering like the beginning of a white shroud. I turned toward the road, breath steady, pulse slow. She thought I was just another tired rancher clinging to a patch of Wyoming dirt. She thought she could push me around with bylaws and barked orders, but people like Marla never imagined the quiet man standing in the dark might carry more authority than her entire board combined. As I headed back up the road, boots crunching in the hardening snow, one thought rose above the storm's roar. What would she do if she knew who I really was? The wind shoved against my back as if urging me to keep moving, to get out of that subdivision before the storm grew teeth. Snow drifted across the gravel path leading toward my cabin, piling up along the wooden fence rails that creaked under the growing weight. My breath fogged the air in thick clouds, each exhale reminding me how quickly the temperature was dropping. Inside, the cabin felt colder than it should have. Without the generator powering the backup systems, the place had slipped into the kind of winter chill that crawls up floorboards and settles deep in a man's bones. I stomped off the snow, hung my coat on the peg beside the door, and lit the old iron stove with hands that still trembled with a mixture of cold and anger. As the fire took shape, its orange glow flickered across the log walls, casting shadows that swayed like restless spirits. I grabbed my worn leather notebook, the one I'd used for years on patrol, recording everything from ranch disputes to county boundary errors, and set it on the table beside the lantern. The pages fluttered in the draft, sneaking through a crack near the window. I steadied them with my palm and began writing. The time I arrived, the condition of the pad, the drag direction, the moment Marla opened her door with that rehearsed smirk. Dates, times, measurements, impressions. Evidence didn't care about emotion. It cared about clarity. The storm rattled the glass again, hard enough to make the cabin groan. That's when I heard a knock, not loud, but insistent, tapping in a rhythm that said the person on the other side wasn't a stranger. I opened the door to find Hank Delroy hunched against the wind, his wool coat dusted white, his hat pulled low. "Evening, Sheriff," he said, voice rough as gravel, but quiet enough not to carry beyond us. Hank had known for a week that I was the county sheriff now, sworn in after the election. He was one of the few who bothered to read the county bulletin board. "Get inside," I told him. "This storm will peel the skin off your face." He chuckled weakly and stepped in, stomping snow onto the mat. Hank had lived on this ridge longer than any of us. 50 years of red Wyoming sunsets etched into the lines around his eyes. But tonight he looked uneasy. "I saw the drag marks," he said without preamble. "Saw you heading toward Marla's place. She give you trouble?" I poured him a mug of hot water, no coffee left. and handed it over. She admitted to taking it. Hank blinked slowly. Your generator? In a winter storm? I nodded. His jaw worked as he tried to find words, but fury settled on his face like frost. She's been getting bolder, he muttered. Real bold since that lakeside developer's been sniffing around. Folks say she's trying to clean up the community so they'll invest. But that's just her way of saying she wants us old-timers out. The wind snapped a tree branch outside, sending a shudder through the cabin. Hank, I said quietly, what else have you heard? He hesitated, then glanced toward the window as if expecting Marla herself to be hovering in the snow. There's talk she's been holding private board meetings, not the regular HOA stuff, closed-door sessions with her little circle. They're whispering about rezoning, new construction, selling off lake access rights, the whole 9 yards. That pulled my attention up fast. Lake access rights are county-governed. She can't just... Sheriff, Hank said, eyes narrowing. She thinks she can do just about anything. I leaned back, letting his words sink in. My generator wasn't the start of something. It was the continuation. She's trying to force you out too, Hank added softly. You know that, right? You're the last rancher on the ridge with shoreline property. That makes you... inconvenient. I felt the crackle of the fire behind me, the familiar warmth trying to settle the cold building in my chest. Hank wasn't exaggerating. I'd seen this pattern before on other lands. Developers looking for a foothold, HOAs bending rules to push long-standing residents into impossible situations. Fines, violations, property code manipulations, paper warfare, and now, stealing a generator in the middle of a blizzard. Thanks for coming by, Hank, I said, rising. You tell anyone else what you saw tonight? Not a soul. Good. Let's keep it that way. He paused at the door, looking at me with the kind of worry that belongs to a father, not a neighbor. Daniel, you know Marla won't stop, right? She'll keep poking, keep pushing. She wants this ridge cleared for her buyers. I know, I said quietly. Then what are you going to do? I looked past him at the storm outside, the swirling white vanishing into the pines. The question burned hotter than the fire behind me. What was I going to do? What was the right move? Legally, professionally, personally? Hank waited for an answer, but none came. Not yet. He touched the brim of his hat, stepped into the wind, and the storm swallowed him whole. When I shut the door and turned back to the table, the lantern light glinted off the metal badge half hidden under my notebook. I picked it up, letting the weight settle into my palm. Sheriff. Not rancher. Not neighbor. Sheriff. And that title carried obligations. I sat back down, opened the notebook, and added a new line in steady handwriting. The generator theft isn't vanity, it's strategy. Snow piled higher against the cabin walls. The fire crackled louder, battling the cold pressing in from outside. Somewhere down the hill, behind her manicured porch and perfect lighting, Marla Hensley was hiding something. Something big enough to risk my safety in a blizzard. I closed the notebook slowly, listening to the wind slide across the roof like a warning. What exactly was she trying to hide from the county? The fire popped behind me, casting warm bursts of light against the window as the storm tightened its grip. Outside, the cabin's wooden siding groaned under fresh drifts, and the snow beat the windows in long, steady breaths. A man learns to hear meaning in weather out here. Tonight, the storm was telling me to look deeper. I stood, walked to the metal filing cabinet beside the desk, and pulled open the bottom drawer. Inside were years' worth of Ridgeview Lakeside HOA documents, meeting minutes, mailers, rule amendments. Most folks toss that stuff. I keep everything. Experience teaches you that paper trails reveal truth long before people do. I spread the stack on the table, the old planks creaking under their weight, and began flipping through them with a pace sharpened by suspicion. Lightning flashed somewhere beyond the ridge, followed by a low rumble that vibrated through the cabin floor. The storm's energy pushed me to read faster, hunting for anything tied to aesthetic orders, emergency regulations, or temporary safety guidelines. And there it was, 37 pages deep in the most recent packet, stamped with yesterday's date. Emergency Visual Compliance Order 14B. I skimmed the lines, and my jaw tightened. Marla had signed off on a new rule banning all visible storm or emergency equipment during community beautification months, in January, during a blizzard warning, and she'd filed it less than 24 hours before my generator vanished. I pushed the paper aside and reached for the deed map pinned inside a leather binder. Its edges were worn soft from years of handling. I unrolled it slowly across the table, weighing the corners with my coffee mug and the old horseshoe Hank gave me when I first settled here. The parchment-colored sheet showed every fence line, easement, and tree boundary stretching across Rourke Ridge. I traced a finger along the western section, my land, until I reached the border with the HOA's common area. That's when I saw it. A red marker line, faint but unmistakable, extended 10 feet past the official easement and into my property. I blinked hard and leaned in. On my land stood 2 of the HOA's decorative lampposts, installed last spring without so much as a courtesy notice. Their bases sat directly past the legal line, buried in my soil, tied into underground wiring that should never have crossed onto private land without a permit. I exhaled through my teeth, a sound almost lost to the storm hammering the roof. This wasn't incompetence. It was trespass. And not just trespass. Unpermitted electrical work on private land. A violation of county safety codes, state energy regulations, and federal building guidelines if it interfered with shoreline infrastructure. I rolled the deed map tighter, pressing my thumb into the center to steady the rising pulse behind my ribs. But I wasn't done. I reached for the HOA's spring construction reports. Marla had bragged about these for months, her vision for Ridgeview Lakeside. They included new walkway lights, lakeside railings, and these awful decorative stone pillars she claimed reflected historical mountain design. I flipped through each page, studying diagrams printed in glossy ink, until one detail stopped me cold. The expansion plan showed a future lakeside community pavilion, a structure extending across the shared shoreline, only it wasn't shared. According to the county deed records, that strip of land had belonged to my family for generations. The pavilion's support beams would cross straight over my property line. They'd drawn the architecture in a way that feigned the lines were flexible, as if boundaries could be bent to the will of HOA creativity. "They're building on my land," I whispered to the empty cabin. No wonder she'd pushed so hard for beautification rules. No wonder she'd targeted the last rancher on the ridge with shoreline property. If she could inconvenience me, corner me, fine me into exhaustion, maybe she believed I'd sell or fold. Maybe she thought she could bully the law the way she bullied neighbors. The fire snapped sharply behind me, throwing sparks up the chimney like it agreed. I gathered the documents into a careful stack. My fingers brushed the metal of my badge where it lay on the corner of the table. Snow moaned against the cabin siding, curling down the eaves in long, hungry waves. It all fit together now, her timing, her arrogance, the generator theft. This wasn't about noise or aesthetics. This was strategy. Remove the rancher, clear the land, build her lakeside empire. But storms don't wash away property rights, and they don't scare O'Rourke. I packed the evidence into a manila folder, double-checking each sheet. The more I read, the clearer it became. Marla hadn't just broken HOA policy. She'd violated state building codes and possibly federal shoreline protections. And if she'd done all this with developer backing, that was a fire waiting for the right spark. When I finally looked up, the lantern flame flickered low, shadows stretching long across the table. Outside, the wind dropped to a dull growl, a strange hush settling over the ridge, as if the land itself held its breath, waiting for what came next. Because one thing was certain. Tomorrow, the county would hear about this. And when HOA leaders violate emergency safety protocols, trespass on private land, and doctor filings to push through illegal construction, they invite a storm far fiercer than the one outside my cabin. The storm of law. What happens when the HOA violates state emergency protocols? The question followed me through the night like a low hum beneath the wind, steady and insistent. By sunrise, the storm had settled into a bitter stillness. Snow flattened against the earth in long, unbroken sheets, and the world outside my windows glowed with that quiet, dangerous calm that always comes after nature finishes speaking. I stepped outside, boots sinking deep, the cold biting my cheeks as I inhaled air sharp enough to sting. I brushed off the truck, the metal cold enough to burn fingertips. The inside was colder than the outside, but the engine groaned awake after a reluctant churn. On the dashboard, the temperature gauge blinked a warning. A morning meant for thick blankets and hot coffee. Instead, I had county business to handle. The road into town was half-plowed, carved into narrow tracks by early ranch trucks heading out to feed cattle. Snow dusted up behind me in white ribbons, and the fence posts lining Route 8 stuck out like tired soldiers half buried in battle. My wipers squeaked across the glass. The world felt tight, focused, ready. Ava Mercer's office sat above the county clerk building, a narrow second-story space overlooking Main Street. The wooden stairs creaked under my boots as I climbed, my breath fogging in the cold hallway. The door was cracked open just enough for warm light to spill through. I knocked once. "Morning," her voice called. "Come in?" Ava sat behind a desk cluttered with legal pads, half-drunk mugs of tea, and stacks of county code books. Her red hair was pulled back in a loose knot, and she had the kind of feu that stayed calm even when the town wasn't. She'd taken the county attorney position 2 years earlier, and had handled more ranch disputes and boundary complaints than most lawyers see in a lifetime. She glanced up as I entered. "Daniel," she said, raising an eyebrow, "you look like a man who didn't sleep." "I didn't," I answered, peeling off my gloves. "We've got a problem." That's never the way a sheriff should start a conversation. I dropped the manila folder on her desk. It hit with a weight heavier than paper should make. She frowned and opened it. The first page, the Emergency Visual Compliance Order, made her expression tighten. She read silently, flipping through photographs of the torn generator pad, the dragged tracks, the illegally installed lampposts, the blueprint showing the pavilion crossing my property line. Ava looked up. "She took your generator," she said slowly, "in that storm. Had it dragged right off the pad. That's property seizure. And this," I tapped the printed order, "was filed less than a day before she did it." Ava exhaled, long and controlled. "Daniel, this is worse than I expected." I settled into the chair across from her, its wooden frame chilled from the morning air. "She's been holding closed meetings. Hank thinks she's prepping the community for developers." "I've heard rumors," Ava murmured, eyes scanning the paperwork. "Nothing concrete. Until now." She flipped to the deed map. "These lights, they're on your land. Installed without permission. Without a permit," she added. "That alone is a violation of Title IX, electrical work across property lines. And she's planning to build a pavilion halfway across my lakefront." Ava rubbed her temples. "She can't. Federal shoreline rules require homeowner consent for any structure touching the water. Even HOA boards can't bypass that." I leaned forward. "But she's trying." "Yes," Ava said, voice firm. "And she filed an emergency order that violates state safety protocols during a blizzard." Silence hung between us. interrupted only by the faint clatter of the clerk's office downstairs. Finally, she closed the folder and folded her hands. Daniel, we need to take this step by step. First, we document everything. You've already started that. Good. Second, we file a formal inquiry into Ridgeview Lakeside's building activities. Third, she returns the generator. That too, she said, though a faint smile tugged the corner of her mouth. But more importantly, this has legal teeth. Unlawful seizure, safety endangerment, trespass, falsified filings. If this goes to court, she'll have a hard time talking her way out. The warmth of the office contrasted sharply with the storm's cold weight still clinging to me. I watched Ava's face as she organized the papers, her movements precise, methodical. She was building a case in her mind, piece by piece. She thinks she can push me out, I said quietly. Ava's eyes lifted. Because she doesn't know who you are. I paused, then nodded. Most folks in the HOA still believed I was just another landowner, quiet, steady, a little worn from long winters. They didn't know about the badge tucked inside my coat. They didn't know about the authority that came with it. Should I reveal my title? I asked. Not yet. Ava shook her head. If she suspects your leverage, she'll change tactics. Or worse, start covering tracks. Let her think she still holds the upper hand. I leaned back, rubbing my thumb over a groove in the wooden chair. You're asking me to let her think she's winning. I'm asking you to let her think she's being clever, Ava corrected. There's a difference. Downstairs, a door slammed. Someone laughed. The normal sounds of town life drifted up, grounding me for the first time since the storm began. Ava slid the folder toward me. Bring me anything else you find, she said. And Daniel? Yeah? Be careful. People who bend rules this hard don't usually stop at paperwork. I stood, pulling on my gloves. I've handled worse. I know, she replied. But they don't. She meant Marla, and the board she commanded like a private army, and maybe even the developers whispering behind closed doors. Outside, the wind had quieted into a low hiss, pushing loose snow across the sidewalk in thin silver ribbons. I stepped off the curb, folder tucked inside my coat. The cold didn't feel quite as sharp now, not with proof in my hands and the law at my back. Still, Ava's question lingered as I opened the truck door. Should I reveal my badge or wait for the perfect moment? The thought rode with me all the way back up Rourke Ridge, bouncing around inside the cab like loose change. By the time I reached the turnoff for my ranch, the sky had dimmed into a cold gray, the kind that never fully becomes daylight during deep winter. Snow kicked up behind the tires, swirling in little tornadoes as I eased through the gate. But something was wrong. 6 neon-colored envelopes, bright as fire against the white landscape, were plastered across my iron gate. They flapped wildly in the wind, each one stamped with the same ugly HOA seal. Property violation notice. I stopped the truck, breath fogging the windshield, and stepped out into the crunching snow. Wind tugged at my coat as I pulled the first envelope free. The paper was thin, cheap, and shook in my gloved hands. Unauthorized fencing structure. Immediate remediation required. I frowned, glancing at the same fence that had stood on this land since my father's day. The second envelope, non-conforming livestock storage unit. They meant the barn, the original barn, the one that predated the HOA by decades. The third envelope, excessive snow accumulation creating hazardous visual conditions. I stared at that one the longest. Snow accumulation. During a blizzard. They were citing me for weather. A gust of wind ripped the remaining envelopes off the gate and sent them swirling across the road like neon birds. I caught 2 more before they flew into the ditch. Each one was worse than the last. Violations for the angle of my roofline. Violations for my truck being visually obstructive. Violations for the firewood stack on the porch, even though it was stacked neatly under a covering my father built with his own hands. Marla wasn't just pushing back. She was escalating. The cold found a path through my coat, prickling the skin beneath. I gathered the notices and headed toward the porch, my boots leaving deep prints across the untouched snow. The cabin stood quiet, smoke rising thinly from the chimney into the gray sky. But the peace didn't reach me. Not after this. Inside, the air was warmer. The fire still glowed in the grate, its crackles echoing softly as I tossed the stack of envelopes onto the table. The colors looked garish against the wood grain. Wrong. Offensive. Like graffiti on a church door. My phone buzzed. A text message from Deputy Cole Whitman lit the screen. "Sheriff, got something you should know. Hensley called the station. Reported you as unstable, aggressive, and a threat to HOA leadership. She wants us to intervene. I told the chief you were off-duty and unreachable for now. But she's pushing hard. Just giving you a heads up." I stared at the message until the letters seemed to blur. She'd reported me to my own department, not knowing I was the department. I dialed Cole immediately. He answered on the first ring. "Sheriff?" His voice was low, cautious. "You all right?" "I'm fine," I said, though the tightness in my voice said otherwise. "What exactly did she tell you?" "She said you were, displaying erratic behavior. Said you came to her door last night in a rage. Claimed you threatened her." I closed my eyes, gripping the phone tighter. "And the chief bought that?" Cole snorted quietly. "Chief's seen HOA types before. He's not buying anything without talking to you. But she's trying to set a narrative, sir." Of course she was. If she could paint me as unstable, anything I filed afterward, the evidence, the violations, the trespass, could be dismissed as retaliation. A classic tactic. One used by people who didn't fight fair. "Thanks, Cole," I said. "Keep me posted." "You got it. And Daniel, watch your back. She's not done." The call ended, leaving a hollow quiet in its place. Outside, the wind shifted direction, rattling the window panes. Snow slid from the roof with a muffled thump. I sat at the table, staring at the stack of violation notices. The paper curled slightly at the edges from the cold. Each one was a deliberate strike, a coordinated attempt to overwhelm, confuse, wear down. Most people would have buckled under it. Maybe that was the point. But I wasn't most people. I reached for my notebook, flipping to a fresh page. Carefully, I began copying each violation, noting the time, the weather conditions, the impossibility of compliance. The pen moved steadily, even as my pulse thudded in my ears. A heavy knock jolted me upright, the kind of knock that didn't belong to neighbors. I opened the door to find Mrs. Hallstrom, my nearest HOA-aligned neighbor, bundled in a fur-trimmed coat. Her eyes darted nervously to the envelopes still in my hand. "Daniel," she said, voice trembling between sympathy and fear. "I came to tell you. Marla's been going door to door this morning. She's asking people to testify that you've been aggressive, that you're unstable." Her voice cracked on the last word. The cold air swirled around her ankles, lifting snowflakes into the entryway. "And what did you tell her?" I asked. She swallowed hard. "I told her she was wrong, but I don't know how long she can pressure folks before they break. You should be careful." She hesitated, then leaned closer. "She's planning something bigger." I could hear her whispering to the board. "They're building a case against you." As she hurried back into the wind, the door closed behind her, leaving me alone in the dim warmth of the cabin again. Pressure, lies, manufactured fear. Marla was tightening her grip. But I felt something else now, too. Not anger, not frustration. Resolve. I gathered the envelopes into a stack, pressed them flat, and slid them into my evidence folder. I wasn't sure when the perfect moment to reveal my badge would come, but I knew this. When it did, she wouldn't see it coming. Would the community break under her intimidation, or begin to question the hand that kept tightening around their throats? The question lingered in my mind like wood smoke trapped in rafters as the sun slid behind the ridge, turning the snowfields blue and gray. By late afternoon, the storm had passed completely, leaving a crystalline silence across the land, the kind of silence that makes a man hear things he's been ignoring. I stepped outside, boots crunching over the frozen crust. The sky was a pale strip of fading gold, stretching above the dark line of pines. The air tasted clean again, cold enough to pinch the lungs, but honest in a way that people rarely are. I breathed it in and let the stillness settle around me. I had work to do. The violations were only one piece of the puzzle. The generator theft, the illegal construction, the rezoning rumors. None of it stood alone. Patterns don't form unless someone forces them to, and Marla had been forcing a pattern for months. I walked the perimeter of my property with a camera and notebook, the crisp air biting my cheeks as I traced the invisible lines that had been mine long before the HOA planted their plastic signs. Fresh snow made it easy to spot disturbances. My first stop was the western fence line, where the land sloped gently toward the shared walkway by the lakeshore. There, under a thin crust of ice, the footprints of contractors, boot treads with the same zigzag pattern, cut across my property. Not one set. Multiple. Repeated. Someone had walked back and forth, carrying equipment. I crouched, brushing the snow away with gloved fingers. Beneath it, muddy churn marks revealed heavy equipment had been dragged across, likely the same machinery used to install the illegal lampposts. I photographed every angle, the depth of the prints, the direction of the tracks, the distance to the walkway. Evidence was the only thing colder and more unforgiving than a Wyoming winter. As I followed the tracks toward the frozen lakeshore, the sun dipped lower, painting the ice in soft shades of lavender and steel. The lake was quiet. No wind, no ripples, just a glassy surface stretching out beneath the glowing dusk. A few ducks, the hardy kind that refused to migrate, waddled near the reeds. Beyond them, I saw the walkway lights flicker to life one by one, casting long yellow reflections across the ice. The same lights installed without permits. The same lights buried on my land. I knelt near the first lamppost. Its base was half hidden by snow, but the crooked angle was unmistakable. The thing wasn't even level. Rust had already begun eating at the bolts. I snapped photos, then shifted to the next one. This one had wiring exposed, thin black cords peeking up from the ground like veins where the soil had settled wrong. I recorded everything. When I circled back toward the cabin, the shadows had long fingers, stretching across the snow like reaching hands. The ridge was quiet, but inside me, something steady and unmovable had settled. The silence before a storm isn't empty, it's gathering energy. Back inside the cabin, I laid out the photos across my kitchen table. The images looked stark under the lantern light. Disturbed snow, misaligned fixtures, footprints stamped deep into my land. Each photo was a puzzle piece forming a picture of negligence and interference so blatant it bordered on reckless. I pulled the HOA bylaws from the desk drawer, flipping through until I reached the construction section. It was all there in black and white. Permit requirements, property lines, safety standards, the need for licensed contractors. Marla and her board had violated nearly every rule they'd forced on the rest of us. I opened my laptop and drafted a formal request for inspection, addressed to the State Department of Residential Safety and Electrical Compliance. It wasn't the kind of agency most homeowners even knew existed. But as sheriff, I'd worked cases involving faulty installations, electrical fires, and unsafe structures. I knew their protocols, I knew their timelines, and I knew they didn't like being lied to. I attached the photos, the deed maps, the amended filings, the dates, the evidence trail tight and undeniable. Before sending, I paused, my finger hovering over the trackpad. Once I filed this, everything would change. Inspections weren't optional, they weren't ignorable, they weren't political, they were law, and laws didn't bend for people like Marla. I clicked submit. A tiny whoosh sound played through the speakers, soft but final. The fire crackled behind me, its warmth wrapping the cabin in a steady embrace as I leaned back in my chair. My badge sat on the table again, just within reach, but I wasn't ready to use it. Not yet. The time would come when showing it mattered. For now, silence was my ally. A quiet sheriff. A quiet investigation. A quiet storm gathering strength. I packed the photos into my evidence folder and checked the window. The ridge was still. The lake reflected a sliver of moonlight. Everything looked peaceful. But that peace was about to break. Inspectors would be here soon, walking straight into the heart of Marla's perfect kingdom. And nothing she'd built would survive the truth. What would happen when real inspectors walked into Marla's perfect community? The answer began forming before sunrise, carried on a stillness so sharp it felt like the land was holding its breath. The next morning broke with a sky washed clean by frost, icy blue, stretched thin over the ridge. The cabins and homes below sparkled with a deceptive calm, each roof capped in white, each window glowing faint amber with dawn light. But beneath that quiet beauty lay a secret. Today, Ridgeview Lakeside would be seen for what it truly was. I stood at my porch rail, the wood chilled under my palm, watching a dusting of snow blow off the tall pines like powdered glass scattering into the wind. The frozen air hummed with the tension I recognized from years on the job. Something was coming. Something big. By 8 o'clock, I heard the rumble of an engine on the road, a steady, measured growl unlike any pickup on this ridge. A white state-issued SUV rounded the bend, tires crunching over the ice. The official seal glinted on the side. Wyoming Department of Residential Safety and Electrical Compliance. Inspector Reuben Keller stepped out first. He was taller than I expected, built like someone who'd spent a lot of years outdoors rather than behind a desk. Sun-weathered face, gray beard trimmed close, heavy boots that sank deep into the snowdrifts. He walked with purpose, with a calm efficiency and that said he'd rather be left alone with the truth than trapped in conversation. "Sheriff Rourke?" he asked, offering his hand. "Daniel," I corrected, shaking it. "Appreciate you getting here so quickly." "Your report was thorough," Keller replied, his breath fogging. "And the weather makes this time sensitive. If electrical work was done improperly, a winter like this'll expose it fast." I nodded, gesturing toward the walkway leading toward the lakeshore. "This way." We started down the path, our boots breaking through the crusted snow. Frost-covered branches brushed our shoulders as we walked. The lake shimmered beyond the trees, a sheet of pale glass under the climbing sun. Keller paused before the first lamppost, squinting at the tilt of its metal base. He knelt, brushing away snow until the bolts appeared, loose, rusted, some barely gripping the ground. "These were installed recently," he muttered. "Last spring," I said. "No permits." He clicked his tongue, pulling a small digital level and a voltage detector from his coat. "And these are supposed to be commercial-grade fixtures?" "That's what the HOA told residents." Keller slid the detector near the wiring. It flashed red, his brows furrowed. "Live current exposed this close to the ground? Bad workmanship. Dangerous, too." We walked to the next light. This one had wiring exposed from the soil, like roots torn from the earth. Keller knelt again, tracing the line with his gloved fingers. "The burial depth is all wrong," he murmured. This won't meet code anywhere in the country. And that spacing, way too close to the walkway. Ice expansion could shear the conduit. I watched his breath plume out, steady and controlled. At the third pole, Keller stood up abruptly. Who installed this? HOA hired a contractor, I answered. Name wasn't listed anywhere in the filings. He shook his head slowly. Because no licensed contractor would have done this. We continued along the path, each lamppost revealing another layer of negligence. Some leaned like crooked teeth. Others flickered with faulty bulbs. A few had cables running too shallow under the snow. Keller photographed everything, speaking the violations quietly to himself as he worked, like a doctor dictating notes on a terminal case. By the time we reached the lakeside railing, his jaw had tightened into a hard line. He looked out at the lake, the frozen water gleaming under a faint curtain of morning mist. The railings beside us were secured by bolts drilled straight into the ground, without anchoring plates. A sloppy job. Cheap. Rushed. This walkway sees regular foot traffic? Keller asked. Every day, I replied. Kids, families. He ran his hand along the railing. The metal wobbled lightly. That's a fall hazard, especially on ice, and someone could hit the lake. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. We turned toward the pavilion outline, still marked by stakes in the snow. Keller crouched again, shaking his head as he inspected the layout. And this structure, they planned to build it here? Half on HOA easement, I said, half on my land. He straightened up, staring at me. Your land? I handed him the deed map, sealed in its plastic sleeve. He studied it, then exhaled, letting a cloud of vapor drift upward like a slow curse. They crossed your boundary without authorization. That's trespass. And if they tied electrical fixtures into underground wiring on your side of the line, that's a major violation. Not to mention the pavilion would touch the shoreline. He paused. That brings federal rules into play. We stood in silence for a moment, snowflakes drifting lazily between us despite the calm. Well, Daniel, he finally said, sliding the map back into my hands. This is bad. This whole installation is a hazard. He pulled out a thick tablet and began tapping through screens, documenting everything. Marla chose that exact moment to appear. I heard the faint crunch of footsteps behind us before she spoke, her voice carrying a smug lilt. Well, well, she said. I see we're getting a little tour today. I turned. She stood at the top of the walkway, wrapped in her pristine white coat, arms folded as if she owned the view behind her. Her smile was tight, sharp. Inspectors weren't on the schedule, she said pointedly. You should have notified the board. Keller didn't even look up. Ma'am, this isn't an HOA appointment. It's a state safety inspection. Her smile faltered. What? A state safety inspection, Keller repeated, standing. Triggered by a formal complaint with sufficient evidence to warrant immediate review under cold weather electrical protocols. She blinked, uncomprehending for a heartbeat. Then her eyes snapped to me. You. The word came out brittle. You filed this. I didn't answer. She stepped toward us, her boots thunking loudly on the icy walkway. This is harassment. This is targeted. This is... Keller held up a hand. Ma'am, I suggest you stop talking until we finish. The violations we've found so far require an immediate shutdown order. Her face drained of color. Shutdown? She whispered. Effective today, Keller said. All walkway lighting, lakeside railings, and construction zones must be closed until brought up to code, and any structures placed on private land must be removed. The wind swept across the lake then, carrying a long, low whistle that filled the silence. Her expression hardened. Who gave you the authority to do this? Keller tapped his badge. The state of Wyoming. Her gaze slid back to me, sharp as shattered ice. Well then, she hissed. "I demand to know who filed the complaint." The moment stretched between us, quiet and heavy. I reached into my coat and pulled out the leather badge case, the same one that had rested against my heart every day since my swearing in. I flipped it open, letting the silver star catch the pale morning light. "Sheriff Daniel Rourke," I said evenly. "Brooks Range District." The breath Marla took froze halfway into her lungs. Even the wind seemed to pause. She didn't see it coming. And now she couldn't unsee it. For the first time since this entire feud began, Marla looked genuinely speechless, her mouth slightly open, her breath turning to frost between us as the morning light glinted off the sheriff's badge in my hand. The wind skimmed across the frozen lake, lifting a spray of powdered snow that danced around her boots. The world around us seemed to pause. Even the pines stood still. "Sheriff?" she finally whispered, the word cracking like thin ice. I closed the badge case with a soft, final snap. "That's right." Her eyes darted wildly, first to Keller, then to the frozen walkway, then back to me, scrambling to reassemble a sense of authority she no longer possessed. The cold didn't hide the panic forming beneath her carefully controlled expression. You misled the board," she stammered. "You didn't disclose. You didn't tell us." "I didn't have to," I said evenly. "HOA membership doesn't override county hierarchy. Nobody's title requires disclosure to your board." Keller stood beside me, arms crossed, the lake wind tugging at his heavy coat. "And regardless of who filed the complaint, ma'am, these violations stand. My findings are documented. A report is already in the system." Her hands curled into fists inside her gloves. "This is outrageous. I'll take this to the full board. We'll contest everything." "You're welcome to try," Keller said dryly. "But a multi-agency review has already been triggered." Her breath hitched. "Multi-what?" Before I could answer, the crunch of tires on snow came from up the hill. We all turned. A county cruiser rolled slowly into view, blue lights off but unmistakable with its black and white body and the emblem painted across the side. Deputy Cole Whitman stepped out, adjusting his scarf against the cold. His boots made hollow thuds on the frozen path as he approached. "Morning, folks," he said, offering a polite nod to Keller. "Inspector, Sheriff." Then to Marla. "Ms. Hensley." She straightened, trying to pull herself back into the role of HOA queen. "Deputy Whitman, thank goodness. I'd like to file a report on the sheriff here. He's been targeting me personally, interfering with HOA business, and—" Cole lifted a sealed envelope. "Ms. Hensley," he said, "I'm actually here on official county business." Her brow knit in confusion. Cole continued, his voice steady. "This is a cease and desist order from Brooks Range County, effective immediately. All HOA board actions involving construction, enforcement, and citations are frozen until a legal review is completed." The color drained from her face entirely this time. "Frozen? You can't freeze us. I'm the president of—" "Were," Cole corrected gently. "Pending investigation." Marla stared at the envelope in his hand as if it were a venomous snake. I watched her inhale sharply, her breath quivering in the cold. "This is insane," she whispered. "A sheriff? An inspection? Now this? You people are overreacting. These are minor issues." Keller lifted his tablet, scrolling through photos. Unlicensed electrical work, exposed wiring, structures built over private property lines, hazard-level installation flaws, shoreline encroachment. These are not minor. "And the generator?" I asked quietly. "Did you consider taking emergency survival equipment during a blizzard minor too?" Her face twisted, fear, anger, confusion, pride all warring behind her eyes. She opened her mouth, but no words came. Cole stepped forward, holding out the order. "Ms. Hensley, you need to acknowledge receipt." Her hand shook as she took the envelope. She stared at it for a long second, as if she could will it away. But reality didn't bend under the weight of denial. Her fingers tightened around the envelope until it crinkled. "Everything I did was for the community," she said, her voice cracking. "To improve it, to raise property values." "Safety should always come before beauty," Keller said softly. "Before profit, before pride." Silence blew across us again, carried on the wind sweeping the lake's surface. The sunlight had grown brighter now, reflecting brilliantly off the ice. So bright, it stung the eyes. Neighbors began to gather near the snowy edges of the walkway, drawn by the presence of an official vehicle and the stiff posture of Marla Hensley, HOA president turned cornered defendant. Their boots made crunching sounds on the path. Murmurs floated through the cold air. "Is that an inspector? What's happening? Did she really take his generator? Illegal wiring? On our walkway? Is the board in trouble?" For once, she didn't have a script to feed them. I stepped back, letting the truth settle on its own weight. My job wasn't to embarrass her. It wasn't to win a personal battle. My job was to uphold the law, no matter who broke it. One of the neighbors, Mrs. Calloway, wrapped in a heavy parka, stepped closer to Marla. "You told us everything you built was approved," she said quietly. "That you had the permits." Marla flinched. It was the contractor's oversight, not mine," another neighbor chimed in. "You fined us hundreds for minor issues, and this whole time you were breaking the law?" Their voices rose, confused, betrayed, hurt. Cole leaned in slightly toward me and murmured, "They're turning on her." I kept my eyes on Marla. Her chin trembled. Snow swirled around her, catching in her hair as the wind picked up near the lake. You could see the exact moment when denial cracked and reality swept through. She wasn't in control anymore. The community finally saw the difference between authority and abuse, between leadership and domination, between right and legal. As the murmurs grew louder, Keller tapped a final signature into his tablet. "Inspections concluded for now. I'll file the shutdown order by noon." Marla stared at him, then at me, then at the neighbors surrounding her. It was over. She just didn't want to say the words. "What final consequence will the community decide for me?" she whispered. Not to anyone in particular, but to the frozen lake, the wind, maybe even the part of herself that still believed she held power. The answer was coming, and it wouldn't be hers to choose. By the next morning, the ridge woke beneath a pale winter sun that glittered across the lake like cracked glass slowly mending. The wind had softened, the storm had passed, and the cold was no longer a threat, just a reminder of how close things had come to turning dangerous. My cabin was warm again, the iron stove humming with steady heat, but something inside me remained alert, listening for the next shift in the air. Trouble wasn't over. It was simply changing shape. Word travels fast in places with long winters and short tempers. By noon, a message slid into my phone from Mrs. Patterson, one of the quieter, older residents. "Emergency community meeting tonight. Mandatory attendance. Bring the evidence." Mandatory wasn't her style. That alone said the ridge was changing. I arrived at the community center just as the sun dipped behind the hills, casting long shadows across the parking lot. The building glowed from within, a soft amber light behind frosted windows. Snow crunched beneath my boots as I stepped inside, letting the warmth wash over me. The room was packed. Neighbors stood shoulder to shoulder, ranchers in thick coats, retirees bundled in scarves, young families with flushed cheeks from the cold. I recognized nearly everyone, except two suited men in the back, observers from the county legal office, no doubt. A hush settled when I entered, though not the fearful kind I'd seen days earlier. This one held expectation. Mrs. Patterson, small but sturdy, stood at the front, holding a clipboard that looked too heavy for her hands. She cleared her throat. "Thank you all for coming," she said, her voice trembling only at the edges. "Tonight, we address the investigation findings, the safety violations, and the actions of our current HOA board, particularly our president." Every head turned toward Marla. She sat rigid in a metal chair, her white coat draped over the back, her hands clasped so tight the knuckles shone pale. Her eyes darted between the inspectors, the neighbors, and me. But she didn't speak. Not yet. She seemed to understand now that every word she said would be weighted, measured, used. Mrs. Patterson continued. "Before we proceed, Sheriff Rourke has supplied documentation regarding property seizure, unlicensed construction, boundary encroachments, and emergency safety violations. These will be reviewed alongside the findings of the state inspection." She gestured to me. I stepped forward, placing the evidence folder on the front table. The papers fanned slightly under the warm air. Photos, maps, dates, filings. The truth laid out in ink and winter light. Inspector Keller rose next. "Ladies and gentlemen, our inspection uncovered 12 electrical safety violations, 4 structural code failures, and 2 instances of unpermitted construction encroaching onto private land. We have issued a full shutdown order." Soft gasps rippled across the room. Keller continued. "Additionally, the pavilion plan would have violated federal shoreline regulations. Had construction begun, fines would have been substantial." The neighbors murmured, some confused, many outraged. A young father with a toddler on his hip raised his hand. "So the lake walkway wasn't safe for months?" "Not structurally, no," Keller replied. "And our kids were running on it," another neighbor whispered. Mrs. Patterson nodded somberly. "Which brings us to the core question. How did this happen under our leadership?" All eyes turned to Marla again. She blinked once, slowly, as though trying to gather the pieces of a collapsing facade. "I didn't mean for any of this," she began. But a voice cut through the room. "You took his generator!" It came from the back, a rancher with frost still clinging to his beard. Marla stiffened. "That generator violated community standards." "In a blizzard?" a mother snapped. "What kind of standard is survival supposed to follow?" The room began to rumble with frustration. I stepped forward, not to silence them, but to steady the course. "Folks," I said, voice firm but calm, "we do this the right way. Law first, order first. That's how we stay neighbors." Silence washed through the room. I turned to Marla. "You created rules that contradicted state emergency protocols. You seized equipment that put lives at risk. And you misled homeowners about permits, boundaries, and safety." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. "This is no longer an HOA issue. This is a legal matter." The 2 county legal observers stepped forward then, revealing their badges. One spoke. "Ms. Hensley, based on findings from the state inspectors and the complaint filed, you are under official investigation for unlawful property interference, falsified construction documents, and misuse of HOA authority." Marla inhaled sharply, color draining from her cheeks. I was trying to improve things. For everyone." Mrs. Patterson's voice broke before she steadied it. "You endangered us, Marla. That's not improvement. That's control." A vote was called. Hands rose around the room. Nearly every homeowner lifted theirs. Only one did not. Marla herself. By overwhelming majority, she was removed as HOA president, effective immediately. Mrs. Patterson accepted the role of interim president with a humbled nod, tears glistening at the edges of her eyes. "First order of business," she said softly. "All fines issued to Sheriff Rourke in the last 7 days are rescinded. Effective now." A second cheer broke out, warm and rising like the first breath after winter loosens its grip. "Second," she continued, We authorize immediate repairs to all documented safety issues using licensed contractors approved by the state. Relief swept the room like a warm wind through tall grass. When the meeting adjourned, neighbors approached me, apologizing, thanking, shaking my hand. The warmth in their voices softened something in me I hadn't realized had gone cold. By the time I stepped back outside, the moon had risen above the frozen lake, casting a faint shimmer across its surface. Snow crunched under my boots as Hank Delroy approached from the parking lot, hands stuffed deep in his coat pockets. "Well," he said with a tired smile, "looks like the ridge finally woke up." "It did," I replied, "and not a moment too soon." The next week passed in a flurry of repairs. Licensed crews replaced every faulty lamp, secured the railings, and redrew boundary lines correctly. The lake walkway gleamed under new lighting. Legal, safe, steady. Neighbors waved more, smiled more. Winter felt less harsh. On the 7th day, Hank helped me reinstall my generator. When it roared back to life, heat filled the cabin like a promise. The wind outside was calm. The ridge was whole again. And justice, quiet, steady, dignified, had finally taken root in frozen ground. If you've ever stood your ground against unfair rules, drop a simple "justice" in the comments so I know I'm not alone. And if you want more stories about folks protecting their land and their dignity out here in the wide American West, go on and subscribe. There's plenty more coming.